Welcome to chapter 5 of the book of Ezekiel. Continues with Ezekiel seeing this image that looks like a man above the firmament, above a throne, who comes and describes to Ezekiel what he needs to do. And here it's continuing from the last chapter of when Ezekiel was told to make a image of Jerusalem and put different things around it as if it was being attacked, and then an iron plate and so forth. It continues here, and it says, "And you, O son of Anthropu, man," anthropology comes from that, "take to yourself a sharp, broad sword for a razor of a barber." Now, we have a lot of items in this chapter. They're basically it's a figure of speech in the different words as they act in different ways. Here, the broadsword, a sharp broadsword for a razor of a barber. Well, a broadsword, this is not the short sword like the Romans used or a knife, but it's a large sword. So it's an exaggeration. And take a sharp one, and you shall acquire it to yourself, and you shall bring it upon your head. That is to shave his hair, and upon your pogonah, your beard. Kephalin, we have cephalic in the derivative. So he's to shave his head and his beard, all of his head to be clean. And then you shall take a yoke balance scale of weights, and you shall part them. The yoke balance was that kind of a balance that was pivoted on a pedestal of some sort, and you put the weights on it, and on the left-hand side, I guess that would be your right, it would go down, and then you put the object where you're weighing on the other, and if you got it equal, then whatever the weight was, that's how much the object was. And here, these weights, he's to take the weights, not the yoke balance scale, and part them. So there are different sizes, I'm not exactly sure. But he says, a fourth part you shall kindle in fire in the middle of the city. And now this is specifically for Jerusalem, I believe, as this fire. And later we, in verse 21, it mentions, and this might be what it was talking about. There's the four are slightly different in 21, but a famine. So this may be a substitution as a figure of speech for famine, a fourth part. And according to the fullness of the days of the siege, I forgot what it was, 390 years, or if you added the 40 years on top of that, that would be 430. And you shall take a fourth part and shall incinerate it in the midst of it. Well, it sounds like almost what they did with the first part, but the first part was a fire kindled in the middle of the city, and here a fourth part of it to incinerate in fire. And to me, it's an utter destruction. That's what it's talking about. And the midst of it, and 21 that also has plague. So this may be referring to the plague of in verse 21. And a fourth part you shall cut in pieces with the broadsword round about it. And a fourth part you shall disperse to the wind. So the broadsword represents death, and the wind is the dispersion of the people. And Ezekiel's being shaven shows that it is a serious matter that's going to happen. When they shave themselves, then something bad happened or is going to happen. And a fourth part you shall disperse to the wind, for I shall empty out a sword after them. So there's going to be a war, a battle, military expedition against Jerusalem, and it's going to empty it out. And you shall take from these, probably of these pieces, of these weights, a few in number, oligus. We have an oligarch, rule of a few, and the arithmo, arithmetic, comes from that. Derivatives, which are in our English derivatives book, which are highlighted here. available in our bookstore. And shall wrap them in your wrapping. So he's to take a few of them, and that's probably what he's talking of, the ones that are going to escape. They're going to be protected, and it's in Ezekiel's wrapping. And from out of these you shall take still more. These, I believe, is the original weights, and shall toss them into the midst of the fire, and shall incinerate them by fire. And fire shall come forth from out of it. It's a total incineration of Jerusalem, which happens with Nebuchadnezzar a little bit later, because Ezekiel was in between the two sieges by Nebuchadnezzar. And you shall say to all the house of Israel, thus says Adonai, Kyrios, this is Jerusalem. Adonai is the same, it's a Hebrew word, and it's been transliterated into Greek into Adonai, Nai, with the diaresis above, which separates the pronunciation of the alpha and the iota. Normally it would be Adonai, but it's Adonai in Greek. And Adonai, we have it in English, and it means a Lord, our master, with the capital K, small U-R-I-O-S. I'm sorry, a Lord with the capital L, small O-R-D. And when you have the capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, it is Yahweh, Jehovah. So here, other places it had Kyrios, if you remember. And here it has the Hebrew word for why they didn't translate it into Kyrios. I don't know, like they did other places. But that is what Adonai is, the master, the Lord. This is Jerusalem. I have placed her in the midst of the nations, and of course not the city, but the people that were in it, another figure of speech, and the ones round about her place. I have placed her, the people, in the midst of the nations, the ones around about Jerusalem. And maybe Moab, they fled to Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and Egypt. And you shall tell of my ordinances to the lawless one from out of the nations. And I believe he's talking about Jews here. Tell them, once they've been taken out of Jerusalem, of the ordinances of God that they had not followed. And my laws to the lawless of the places round about her. And I probably could take out that to the lawless, but basically that's what it was talking, because it says here, to the lawless one from out of the nations, and my law to the lawless of the places round about her. For they thrust away my ordinances, and it wasn't the other people in those nations, they never had them in the first place, but the Jews that were sent there did. And in my laws, and they went not by them. So they ignored the laws of God, as we've seen so much, and worse in idolatry. We've seen that in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the what are called the minor prophets, and Daniel. On account of this, thus says Adonai Kyrios, because your opportunity, and I added for lawlessness, is from out of the nations. That's where they got these things. All these idols came from the nations around about, starting with Solomon. And in my laws you went not, and my ordinances you observed not. I have observed here for 4160, as you remember. Pieo is to do, basically to do, but it depends on the context. And you wouldn't say, and my ordinances you did not. Oh, you could, but I put observed not. But neither according to the ordinances of the nations round about you, you observed not. So even when they went to these nations, they were lawless among the nations. Now, what is lawlessness? Is it the lawlessness of God, or is it the lawlessness of the nations, or is it the lawlessness of both? And it kind of reminds me of in my time here and being born before the Second World War, of the Jews that were in Germany, and they did not observe the laws of God there, and they did not observe a lot of the laws of the Germans, and became anathema to the Germans, to the point of where Hitler went in and it was a Holocaust and killed millions of them. Not that they deserved such, but I believe if you look at the time right before Hitler, the Weimar Republic, and I have an interesting booklet that was written on the sexual degradation in Berlin that was going on, and it was a lot of it came from the Jewish media, if you want to call it, at that time, as the Jewish media controls mainly in the United States. And even in Israel, you have a week with the homosexuals parading and having a big festival today in Israel. So this observing not God's ordinances and even not among the nations, I think it's probably still the case today. That's my take. Now, you may disagree with it and hate the things that I'm saying because they seem anti-Semitic, but my purpose of bringing these up is the same, hopefully, as Ezekiel, and that's for repentance and for these people to see that God did send his Son, Jesus Christ, to deliver them from the harm. But by denying him, it seems like they have to go through these terrible times, and now the beast will be arriving, I believe, fairly soon I believe in Jerusalem, and it's going to get really bad. The world is going to be affected by this. He says, "Behold, I am against you, and I shall execute judgment in the midst before the nations." So here he's going to do this judgment before the nations. Now the judgment was against the nation of Israel when Nebuchadnezzar finally took Jerusalem, and then later with the Romans, the time of Jesus after the crucifixion, about 50 years, 30 years, 40 years later, and then 2,000 years they were gone. So the judgment before the nations, and we'll see what's going to happen here next, because Israel is now again a country. "And I shall do among you what I have not done, and I shall not do like unto them again against all your abominations." Now, I looked at this and I'm thinking, now which time zone is he talking about? The time at that period of time with Nebuchadnezzar, with the Romans, or in the future? And he says, "I'm not going to liken to them again against all of your abominations." To me, the abominations are obviously going on in Israel. So and if he's not going to do it again against the abominations, then this has to be a reference to the future, I believe. That's the way I see it, end time. Description here. "On account of this, fathers shall eat the children in your midst," famine in the city of Jerusalem, "and children shall eat fathers. And I shall execute," now we have PAO again, 4160, "execute judgments among you, and shall scatter all the rest of you unto every wind." And that is what happened to them basically during the Roman time, more so than the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And so that's another possibility of if Jerusalem falls to the beast, that many of these people will be taken out. "On account of this, as I live, says Adonai Kyrios, assuredly, because you defiled my holy things in all your loathsome things, and in all your abominations, I also thrust you away. My eye will not spare, and I will not show mercy." They had the defilements of Molech set up in the valley of Hinnom, in the southern valley outside of the gates and walls of Jerusalem, and they sacrificed their children, and they put the abominations in the temple area, and so forth. And so he will not spare. Now, we know that there's going to be another abomination because it talks about Daniel, the abomination of desolation. And after that comes the end, and that's with the beast, and another temple will be built. And what this abomination is in that temple, we don't know yet. But desolation, well, we do know it's a desolation, so somehow it's going to be wiped away, maybe for a long period of time before the Lord comes back. Could be 1,000 years or so before the Lord comes back and starts his 1,000-year reign. And then he continues in verse 12. I said 21 earlier, and I'm sorry, it was verse 12. The fourth part of you shall be consumed by plague. And at the beginning, it didn't mention plague. In verse 2, it had fire in the middle of the city. And then a fourth part of you shall be finished off by famine. And it was not mentioned in verse 2. It had incineration, utter destruction, and I believe it was the famine here, or vice versa, in your midst. And a fourth part of you will be dispersed into every wind, and that was mentioned in 2. And a fourth part of you shall fall by the broadsword, and that was death, and that was in verse 2. And a sword I shall empty out after them. So there's going to be some type of a military expedition against the people of Jerusalem, could be the future. And my rage shall be exhausted, and my anger against them. I don't see that his rage was exhausted after Nebuchadnezzar, because he wiped them out with the Romans. So I believe it's a future again. And I shall enjoin, and you shall know. I'm going to enjoin. I'm going to deal with this situation I'm talking about, and you will know, for I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal, in my exhausting my anger against them. And you'll know. And maybe a future, and somebody, you're maybe picking up these videos years ahead of time, and you'll see this, and you'll see that the anger of the Lord, it will be exhausted. And hopefully, if you experience the anger of the Lord, the wrath of the Lord, then I hope the respite will come to you, and it will be exhausted. And I shall make you into a wilderness, even your daughters round about you, in the presence of all traveling through. So it's going to be a wilderness, which it was for a couple of 1,000 years, and maybe in the future. And you will be bemoaned and wretched among the nations round about you, in my executing among you judgments in anger and in rage. And when there's anger and rages together, that is really bad. Orgy, we have the word orgy as a action that's all inflammatory, like being excited and so forth, in different ways that it takes, the orgy can be an anger, it can be a sexual orgy, it can be different types of orgy. And in vengeance of rage. So he's in rage, again, the same word, in vengeance against the things that they are doing. Things that they are doing today certainly will deserve the vengeance of the Lord, and the vengeance of the Lord will come against the sinners of the world. And we are all sinners, but thank you, Jesus, for going to suffer the shame of the cross and dying for us in our sins, that we will be spared. I, Kyrios, have spoken. In my sending the arrows of famine upon them, and there's a figure of speech. Famine is not an arrow. An arrow is something that delivers destruction, hurts somebody, kills. And this is going to be something sent on that will kill them. Then they will be in want. And apostolo, that's apostolic. We have the Apostolic Bible we're reading right here, and being sent out, being sent from. I will send them to ruin you. the arrows of the famine, and I shall gather famine unto you, and shall break the reliance of your bread. He could be talking about the time there of Nebuchadnezzar. And I shall send out against you famine and ferocious wild beasts. The wild beast is in the book of Revelation, and it's also here, but it's got it in the plural. So probably talking about the ferocious wild animals here, not necessarily the beast. Could be. It's a possibility I saw. And I shall punish you and plague thanatos. That word thanatos, we have thanatology, the study of death. It is a word that is thanatos, thanatology. And when it's death, and we know when it means death is somebody has died. But generally it's plague and it's other usage, because we called the Black Death, which was a plague, called it the Black Death. And so thanatos, plague, and hema, blood, hematology, study of blood, comes from that word, shall go through upon you. And a sword I shall bring. This is a machaira. This is like the Roman short stabbing sword, different than the other broadsword. I shall bring upon you, and that could be talking about the Romans. I, the Lord, have spoken. So this now is what is going to happen to Jerusalem. Next chapter, our next video, will go through against the mountains of Israel. It expands from Jerusalem to all of Israel. Hope you'll join us in chapter 6, and God bless.